Hi everyone, so welcome back to the audit, and today we will be discussing and understanding the audit sampling that is performed in the audit. So let's understand what is audit sampling, how it is done, what's its relevance, where to use everything. So given the overview of the audit sampling is the application of the audit procedures to a sample of less than 100% of the items within the population and using the results from the testing the sample to provide a reasonable basis for the conclusion about the population. So as we cannot audit the entire 100% transactions, the auditor is required to get the samples for which the detailed testing is done, test of details is performed for those samples to obtain the comfort of the audit that they are performing. So depending on the judgment, the auditor decides the extent of the population to be tested. The auditor is only providing the reasonable assurance and not the absolute assurance. So, for the reasonable assurance, the auditor can get a conclusion from the samples that they are testing, comparing the various methods of selecting the items for the testing, like selecting all the items, population within a small number of the large transactions, selecting the specific items, or audit sampling. So when does the auditor do the audit sampling? Twice. So there are two stages where auditor takes out sampling, and one is in the internal control where test of controls are performed. Another is a substantive test where test of details are performed. So there are two phases where audit sampling is done. So internal control, the samples are taken out to check if the controls are operating effectively or not, and in substantive phase the test of details are performed to check the transactions account and disclosures are appropriate or not, which acts as the appropriate audit evidence. So so what are the types of the audit sampling if we discuss? So there are basically two types of the audit sampling: attribute sampling and variable sampling. So at first discussing the attribute sampling are applicable to the internal control in the test of the controls, where auditor needs to give the judgment conclusion that they rely or not rely on the controls, like if the controls are reliable or not reliable, and that is based on the certain attributes that the auditor tests. So in the test of the control, auditor doesn't verify the numbers, but auditor tests the operating effectiveness. So if the procedures, the controls are in the place or not, and if that is reliable or not reliable, that is tested in the attribute sampling, which is applicable for the internal controls testing. In variable and the other is the variable sampling, which is applicable in the substantive test of the details, and here auditor gives the conclusion that the numbers are transactions disclosures are correct or misstated. If misstated, then that should be rectified, and if corrected, the conclusion is given as a correct. So variable sampling, in the we test the numbers, transactions, balances, so that is the variable, and the attributes are based on the attribute of the controls. So if that is reliable or not reliable, that is tested. Now moving forward, how to do audit sampling? So statistical sampling. So in statistical sampling, quantitative measure and formulae for the sample size and evaluation of the sample results are performed. Advantages of the statistical sampling are: it designs efficient sample, evaluates the sample results, measures the sufficiency of the evidence obtained, objectively quantifies the sampling risk to limit it an acceptable level. Also, there are additional cost of the training as needed to specialized experts. Uh, Also, auditor will use the professional judgment to define the population and sampling unit, select appropriate sampling method, determine the acceptable level of the sampling risk. Here, evaluate the result based on the appropriateness of the audit evidence, nature of the deviations, projects that results to the population. Moving forward, the non-statistical sampling are the where auditor uses judgment to determine the appropriate sample size and evaluation of the sample results, which include the measurement of the sampling risk. Even if the auditor rigorously selects a random sample, it is non-statistical sample if the auditor does not use statistics for evaluation of the sampling results. Sample size would ordinarily be comparable to the sample size in the statistical sample. Also, when using the non-statistical sampling, auditor is not required to compute a corresponding sample size using the appropriate statistical technique. There is additional risk in the non-statistical sampling, that is significant divergence from the sampling concepts may make the testing ineffective, and here it is address the risk by providing the auditing with the non-statistical sampling guidance and encouraging the consistent sampling applications. Now, talking about the approaches in statistical sampling, the quantitative methods are used to determine such a sample size and evaluating the sample results, whereas in the statistical sampling, the judgments are used to determine the sample size and evaluating the sample results. Uh, so in both the cases, statistical and non-statistical, it is required to use a professional judgment by the auditor. Both can provide a sufficient appropriate audit evidence, and both involve the sampling risk. Now, lastly, I will show you the summary of all those we have discussed. So audit sampling are divided into two main factors: attribute sampling and variable. In attribute, attribute testing is performed in the test of the controls, whereas variable is performed in the substantive test of the details. Further, to divide the sampling, there is a statistical and non-statistical, and statistical and non-statistical is is under both the attribute and the variable, and that depends upon the auditor's judgment that what they are using. And there is further bifurcation of the statistical sampling, that's like sub unit and sub contents of that. We will discuss the further of the statistical sampling understanding that in the next chapters. So up to here, let me know if you have any comments, have any questions in the sampling. I will help you to resolve those out. Thank you for staying connected. Let me know if you have any queries. Bye.